So tonight we're talking about network security for Smarties. I called that this because I felt that the alternative, right, was probably copyrighted for one, and secondly, I figure if you're in this class, then you must be smart. So that is why I titled it this way. All right, who am I? Real quick. So just quick background here on some of the things that I have done in the past, where I've been, what I've worked on. Currently, I'm the Director of Security Architecture and Engineering at IHG. I've been at IHG now a little over 3 years. Before that, I did a bunch of consulting, both for JB and started off my career at IBM as a business consultant. Before that, I went to Georgia Tech, spent about 5.5 years there, but finally got out, as they say. And that's pretty much it. I've always had an interest in cyber or technology. Done a lot of different things and worked at a bunch of different companies. As a consultant, I think I was at or supported at least over 70 different clients in tons of industries, finance, hospitality, pharmaceuticals, lots of different verticals there. So a lot of interesting experiences, but main themes have always been around management and cyber, I would say, and definitely a focus on technology. All right, so what we're talking about today, what I'd like to cover are exploits that go over the network or at least exploit the network. We're going to dig into some of the common network protocols and look at some of their interesting vulnerabilities and see how those exploits are carried out with these different network protocols. Want to spend a little bit of time talking about VPN. It is a seemingly legacy technology, and yet we still have it. So why do we have it in an age of TLS and SSL encryption? Talk a little bit about that. What are some of the pros and cons of it still? And then dig into network security tools, and in particular, seeing how they work together to provide that layers of security that we talk about so often. What I'm not going to go over, but I had originally planned to, but realized that this is probably too long as it is, but we're going to get through as much as we can. We're not going to dig into networking fundamentals. We're going to focus on the security aspects. I'm not going to talk about the OSI model, although I do feel that that is a very good fundamental way to view the network. We're not going to talk about how to do network security monitoring. I actually did a talk. That was one of my first ones, I think, for KSU. So there's probably an archive of it out there somewhere. We're not going to talk about email, even though email definitely goes over the network, but that is its own conversation. And then I'd originally planned to talk about cloud networking concepts, at least to give a primer on it. But we're going to avoid that just because of time. Maybe that'll be another talk sometime. All right, so exploits in the network. I just have one slide on it, but I do have these icons, and we will be talking about these as we go through the different, all the following slides. So starting top left, we have vulnerabilities and default credentials. So this is not really network, but it is a system that is accessed over the network, right? That is vulnerable to either something that's being exploited that's a vulnerability, or that they have default or easy to guess credentials, right? And then somebody can take it over, they can disrupt that system, they can crash it or use it for something else. Compromised credentials or keys, right, is slightly different, where these are now, they haven't guessed them and they're not the default, but they've stolen them somehow or gotten access to them, and allows them to essentially take over that machine and use it without alerting potentially anyone to their use. It allows them to, do the same types of attacks, right? Disrupt, crash, or take it over. Bandwidth flooding, this is where the attacker sends a deluge of data packets to a host. And so it's causing the network link to become congested. You're denying legitimate packets from reaching the server and causing a denial of service. Although, as you'll see, for some of these attacks, some of the flooding attacks make use of that in order to do man-in-the-middle type attacks as well. And then connection flooding, which is where not where you're sending a bunch of data packets in one stream, but you're sending lots of little connections all at the same time, and you're causing that host to be overwhelmed. It can't accept legitimate connections, and again, it's a flooding attack, and it can't do its job. A distributed denial of service attack is essentially a flooding attack, but now instead of using one system to attack, right, I'm using lots and lots and lots, typically a botnet. And we're going to talk about botnets when we talk about some of the network tools, in particular a WAF or web application firewall. And a denial of service can be quite difficult to detect and defend against, rather than a denial of service attack from a single host, because you have so many. But we'll talk about that one a little bit more as we get further in. Packet sniffing. So this is where you're making a copy of whatever's passing along the wire, and then that can be abused later, right? You can review it if it's in clear text, or you can try to brute force it or decrypt it if you have a key, etc., to view it offline. And it is passive, meaning that there is no way really to detect it because you're just making a copy of whatever passes by. Address spoofing. So this is where we are putting false source addresses onto the network, and it's a form of man in the middle, if you will, to try to redirect traffic to the malicious endpoint. So we're going to talk about DNS spoofing and hijacking, as well as DHCP spoofing, and again, all with the intent of redirecting traffic from where it's supposed to go. Then man in the middle, or person in the middle, if we want to be more politically correct. A malicious attacker, right, is where they're trying to put themselves into the middle of whatever's going back and forth on the wire. And it's, again, rerouting or potentially sending on malicious information, compromising the actual packet and sending on a different message. And then compromised endpoints. So this one, again, is not really the network itself, but it's where you have a system inside that you thought was trustworthy, and now it's been compromised somehow, and can allow them now to exfiltrate data or allow them to establish a foothold and move laterally, etc. But the point being that the way they're getting compromised is over the network, right? They're being downloaded or being tricked into downloading some sort of malicious payload. So just keep these in mind. I do keep the icons as we go along as I call out different attacks. So now jumping into just common network protocols, quick refresher on DHCP as to how it works, right? So I called this the Oprahs of IP addresses, because you have all these systems out there and they're all saying, hey, I need an IP address. And it says you get an IP address, you get an IP address, etc. It hands out more than just your IP address, right? It can assign subnets. It can tell the system what the gateway is to get to public internet. It tells it what DNS to use. You can set the network time protocol server. The one I like, of course, is tic.gottech.edu. And it also, the way it works, right, is you have a DHCP server, you have a client that wants the IP address, and it says, hey, I need an address. So it sends a discovery message out to the network. The server responds back saying, okay, you can have an IP address. And then the client says, basically requests it and reserves it and says, okay, I'll take it. And then their server acknowledges it and says, great, it's yours. And it finishes up that handshake, and the client now gets assigned an IP address. Tying back to the OSI model, one of the things I found interesting in researching this, because at first I was like, oh, DHCP, it's probably layer 2 or layer 3. It's definitely a argument online, but where I landed, and I think makes sense, is that DHCP is a service that provides the information, which is layer 2 and layer 3 information, but it seems to be mostly considered a layer 7 protocol, which I thought was interesting. Okay, so the thing to keep in mind here is that DHCP does not have security built in, right? So has no authentication built in. It leaves transactions unprotected by default. So on the left-hand side, there's 3 major types of attacks here. Again, tying back to flooding attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, and snooping. You have a rogue DHCP server, which is where a client sends out a request, says, hey, I want a DHCP assignment. The attacker is trying to listen for it and send a response with an offer of an IP address before a legitimate server can send out the correct address. And so once the rogue server connects to that client, now the client's talking to the rogue server, and it can redirect, like, for example, its DNS requests or other things. DHCP spoofing is where you're trying to disrupt communications. So you're sending out forged MAC and IP addresses to either the server or the client side on the network, and it can make the server think that a client has given up its lease, and therefore, or it can cause the opposite side, that the client thinks that they no longer have a valid address, and therefore they can either be scooped up by a rogue server, or it just causes mayhem because nobody can talk to anybody because they're constantly requesting and dropping connections as to their IP address. And then DHCP starvation, which is where the attacker floods the network with requests to collect address leases from the server. So it's forcing, again, a need to renew addresses for anybody that's, or I should say, it basically uses up all of the server addresses that are or leases that are available, and causing a denial of service for anybody trying to get a new IP address. So on typically the network switch, not on the firewall, but on a switch, you can enable DHCP snooping and port security. There are different names depending on the make and model of switches and firewalls, but in general, these are the most common terminology. DHCP snooping has two features to it. One is trusted ports, where the DHCP server connections are explicitly trusted, so that any illegitimate offer responses are going to get dropped at the switches and not make it down to the clients. And then DHCP snooping database is where it keeps a running list of the legitimate DHCP transactions with that legitimate server, and therefore any illegitimate lease, release, or offer messages get dropped and not sent on to the clients or the server. Port security is another alternative, and it's attacking the DHCP starvation, or mitigating, I should say it, and it's where it limits the number of unique MAC addresses allowed on each switch port. So if you send a whole bunch of spoofed ones, they're going to just get discarded once the maximum number of MAC addresses is reached. So that's the first protocol. I'm fine. If anybody has questions, by the way, put them in the chat. I do have the chat up on another screen. I am keeping an eye on it, and we can have a quick conversation. We do have a lot of material, but that's okay. We can get through what we can. So ARP. ARP is address resolution protocol, and it works on layer 2 of the OSI model. Are DHCP or static connections more secure? Good question. There's not an easy answer to that. They both have pros and cons, right? I think I would argue static connections are probably more secure for a couple reasons. One, if it's static, then I always know that that IP is assigned to a machine, and therefore if that machine does something, it's a lot easier to figure out which machine is doing that activity, if it's malicious, for example. So it makes incident response at least a lot faster to identify what machine, what's the purpose, and what's it being misused for. DHCP is more for convenience, I would argue. But I'm sure there's a bigger discussion that could be had there. So going back to ARP real quick. So like I said, ARP resolves the IP addresses and converts, it takes a MAC address basically and maps it to IP addresses. I tried to put up Windows commands here anywhere as we go along, where I thought it would be an interesting exercise if you want to bring up a DOS prompt and you can follow along and just run the commands, see what they look like. Don't put the parentheses verbose. I was putting that on for V for verbose. But you can see basically your mapping that your local machine is keeping an eye on of the network around you as it sees all of these ARP requests. So common vulnerability to the ARP protocol is cache poisoning attacks. And essentially on the left-hand side, right, we've got an ARP protocol. OB1 and the droid, right, are two different systems. OB1 sends out an ARP request saying, hey, I'm looking for a droid with this IP address. Droid replies back saying, yep, I'm that droid. ARP cache poisoning attack is where we have a man in the middle, and it says we've got the legitimate OB1 trying to get to the legitimate droid number 2 on the far side of the screen, and it says I'm looking for that droid, but then the droid in the middle, right, which is a .3, says I'm that droid, when in reality it's not, and so it's tricking OB1 into talking to that droid in the middle versus the legitimate droid on the far side. The implication of this, right, is that now I can convince OB1 to talk to the wrong system, and I can either intercept that traffic, anything that he would send, I can pretend to be it and get information that I shouldn't have access to. So how do we prevent this particular one? ARP poisoning attacks. So on network switches again, because again, this is a layer 2 protocol, you can turn on dynamic ARP inspection if it's available, and it essentially looks for packets that appear suspicious, that are malformed, or that may not be following the correct transmission timing. On network switches, you can also turn on port security to, again, only allow a single MAC address on that port switch. Problem with that being that it's not scalable, right? If you want to have a VLAN with a whole bunch of MAC addresses behind that single switch or switch port, that's not going to work. And then you can also implement network isolation. So essentially dropping ARP messages beyond, so they don't travel beyond the local subnet. And then also to try to mitigate having somebody doing the cache poisoning attack, because a lot of times what they're trying to do is get you to try to authenticate against them versus another system. You want to encrypt your data, especially credentials. So any authentication methods that you're using that are passing credentials, you want to be encrypted on the network so that that droid in the middle can't see them. All right, that was a lot, but we'll keep going here unless somebody has a question. Next one is ICMP, which has a great attack called a Smurf attack, hence the little blue people on the screen. So ICMP, right, ping is on layer 3, and it's mainly used to determine if data is reaching its intended destination in a timely manner, but you can use it for other things as well, but it's mostly a network troubleshooting protocol. If anybody ever asks you on a interview what port ping uses, tell them it doesn't have one, and it will do well. So common vulnerabilities, like I said, it can be abused to conduct man-in-the-middle attacks as well as denial of service attacks, which is what the Smurf attack is. So it's where you send out an ICMP echo request to the network broadcast address of a spoof victim, and it basically makes everybody else on the network respond back to that victim with the reply, and it can bring them down. This was actually done in 1998 against the University of Minnesota. It brought down their entire regional network for the statewide internet provider. And the lore on the internet, right, is that it was called after the Smurfs because of the Smurf characters' abilities to take down larger enemies since they are very small by working together. So how do we prevent this? Again, you can turn off the ability on the router to broadcast any broadcast request, basically drop it at the router so that it doesn't propagate throughout the network. You can also configure at the host level to also not respond to broadcast requests. And you can use a web application firewall in front of your network, like using a WAF in the cloud, as we'll talk about later. That can also detect and drop incoming broadcast requests so they don't get propagated beyond your router. And then also using network segmentation. You want to limit that blast radius so that if you have less hosts that are, if they did respond, to take down and do a denial of service attack, but secondly, that it won't just propagate throughout the entire network all at once. BGP and MPLS, I don't have any really cool cartoons or pictures here, I'm sorry. But BGP works actually on layer 5, layer 6, and layer 7. It uses TCP 179 as a source port and then negotiates what the destination port is going to be. It is used, the reason I'm bringing up both of these is because these are very common enterprise networking protocols, and they both do not have security, again, built into these. A lot of these protocols you will find they're historical. Security was not a thing when they designed it, and unfortunately that leaves a lot of open holes that we have to mitigate. So BGP basically is used for ISP to ISP to negotiate routes, and it's auto scaling or auto negotiating. And the problem is that you can overflow or do an overflow attack on routing tables, and you can basically hijack routes by announcing illegitimate routes, and you can do man-in-the-middle attacks on it, and there's other attacks as well. This is very common, unfortunately, and it's very interesting to watch in the news. So this is one that was pretty recent, and basically there was a Russian telecom. They have a autonomous system number 12389, and their network started announcing an Apple route. And the problem is that Apple does not utilize something called route object authorization, and therefore, which basically says that this is a authorized route and nobody else can broadcast on it. And because they don't, and there's good legitimate reasons for doing it both ways, but when somebody was trying to get to Apple and their network block, they may have been redirected into Russia. A lot of times what you'll see in the news is you'll see that like all of the Middle East traffic all of a sudden started going through like North Korea or Russia, or it could go through, all of it all of a sudden started going through Nigeria for an hour. And most of the time, this is due to route hijacking for BGP. And the idea being that if a country can all of a sudden see everybody else's traffic for a while, they can take that offline and they can digest it, go through it, see what was unencrypted, or try to break the encryption. And they have as much time as they want because they've got a copy sitting right there. So MPLS is an interesting one. So MPLS is used by a lot of companies, and it's a historical or legacy type private network, if you will. It's really designed to speed up latency. Basically, it's got a bunch of different routers and switches that put special encapsulating labels, as they call it, so multi-protocol label switching, and it encapsulates the data with a pre-coded or predefined network route to get from point A to point B as fast as possible or as efficiently as possible. So it's a very efficient and fast protocol, but again, it does not have security built in. And even though it's a lot of times considered a private connection, it does not have encryption turned on by default. And so you have to be considerate of that if you are using an MPLS vendor. Most telecoms provide this as a service, that anything you send through it, they in theory could make a copy for offline review. So you want to either ensure that you've turned on encryption or encrypt the data that you put onto the network, essentially. Okay, next one is DNS. So DNS, I'm not going to talk too much about how it works here, but essentially, right, you're taking a fully qualified domain name like google.com, and you want to get to the IP address so that your machine knows how to talk to it. And the problem is, again, it does not have security built in. It's vulnerable to a bunch of different types of attacks, as well as being able to be abused to do other denial of service attacks. In addition to it, it's also a common favorite by attackers to basically hide illegitimate traffic within DNS traffic. So there are a couple things we can do to help mitigate. So one is DNSSEC. It is a protocol that uses digital signatures to verify that the DNS data that you're getting is coming from an authentic source. So that helps mitigate cache poisoning attacks. But it does not encrypt the DNS request in and of itself. So anybody that can sniff the wire and see your request go by can still see what you're trying to get access to, which domain you're trying to go to. You can encrypt it, and there's pros and cons doing this. So it helps encrypt it so that somebody doesn't know who you're trying to talk to on the net. But at the same point or same time, from a enterprise perspective, it means that it's harder to identify command and control traffic that's talking to an external DNS that may be a malicious source. So there's definitely pros and cons you have to consider over whether you want to turn this on. In general, though, I do think it is a good thing to enable. I tried to put little keys, by the way. This, I think, is the first slide for anything that I thought was an extra interesting piece of information. So in particular, when I'm talking about exfiltrating data, right, and hiding command and control traffic, things when you're monitoring DNS requests that you can look for, right, as if you start to see thousands of hosts or subdomains requests on a single domain. So that would mean that you're seeing a machine reaching out to abcd.google.com, and then it reaches out to efg.google.com, and then it's thousands and thousands of subdomains all in a short period of time or over time might be a indication that those subdomains are actually encoded pieces of information that is getting sent out, or that there may be other information that's encoded or encrypted within the request that's getting exfiltrated out. Also seeing large DNS queries with high entropy, meaning it has a very unusual signature. So it's going to, AB13597, some ridiculously long name that is meaningless.com, right? So it's a very unusual website. Or DNS in its response has TXT records, and those you can put in a lot of information into, So you can also, if you see really large ones, that's atypical and could indicate that there's like base 64 encoded or other encoded type data that's getting exfiltrated through the responses to the DNS server. You can see high volumes of DNS resolution failures. That may indicate a command and control software that's trying to reach out, and only when the DNS server pops up, DNS server, to send back a command will it resolve. Otherwise, it's just going to keep failing. Or if there are baby domains which are registered very recently, especially if you see a lot of these, that may indicate that it's a new command and control server that's just been stood up and should definitely be looked at because it's unusual. Any questions on this one? I'll keep going and watch chat. Almost done with common protocols. So SSH, FTP, and SFTP. All of these are, well, SSH is using encryption, public key cryptography, to authenticate clients and create a encrypted connection for exchange of data, right? SFTP is basically FTP, file transfer protocol, tunneling through SSH, and so it's encrypting it. It's doing it in an efficient manner, but it's encrypted, versus FTP is not. And FTP, anything that gets sent over it, if you can sniff that traffic, you can recreate the packets that went over it. You'll be able to see whatever file was transferred. SFTP is going to be vulnerable to the same exact attacks as SSH. SSH is vulnerable to brute forcing, so trying to guess the password, essentially, using rainbow tables with common usernames and passwords, or pre-hashed tables of passwords. And then obviously if somebody steals your keys, then they can use it to view whatever you pass over SSH as well. Overall, though, SSH is considered assuming it's configured properly, is considered a secure protocol that doesn't really have any major vulnerabilities, as long as, again, you're using an up-to-date version and it's configured properly. All right, VPN. So, and keeping a time check, I think we're doing pretty good here. So again, the point of talking about VPN is that why do we have them, right? We have TLS today, which provides encrypted, port 443 connections. Essentially, you could argue it's very similar to like SSH. And so it should be secure, right? Why do we have to use a VPN still? So the thing is that a VPN does two things, right? It's authenticating that both sides of a VPN connection are good, and it's either encrypting the data payload, the data header, or both. The thing is that by default, and these are some, cons against it, is that they do not encrypt the data payload by default, or at all, potentially. Some of them don't encrypt the data header, and that they can be set up as a split or a full tunnel. So I've worked at a number of different companies. I've had access to many different VPNs, and I guarantee that when you get told, here's your VPN and here's how you run it, nobody ever sits you down and says, this is a split tunnel or a full tunnel. And so people get a false sense of security. They go, oh, I'm at Starbucks, I'm on VPN, I'm secure. Not true necessarily. It might be true, it might not. If it's a split tunnel, then only the applications or protocols that you want are going to go over the VPN. Everything else is going out to, the internet through whatever normal connection you're going to set up over to whatever server it is, right? So if that server that you're connecting to is using port 80 and is unencrypted, then everything you're sending out over Starbucks is going to be unencrypted. And so you're not being protected by that VPN unless it's going through the tunnel that goes back to your data center. Versus full tunnel forces everything that you're sending off your client to go through that tunnel to your data center or wherever the VPN termination point is before exiting and going out to the internet. So there are two different ways also to set this up. You can do end-to-end encryption, which is the bottom left, right? That's encrypting only the payload. So it doesn't hide where your VPN connection is going, where it's going to get decrypted and dropped. So you can see PC1 and PC2 on either side of that connection by observing the traffic of the VPN traffic. Versus link encryption is where you are not talking directly to PC2. It's going to a VPN server, which is then dropping the encryption and sending on to the final destination. So it's doing an extra encryption with an external wrapper or header around it that says send this data to the VPN server. So it hides your final destination metadata so that somebody doesn't know where you're actually talking to. So they both have pros and cons. The link encryption's got a little more overhead and it takes a little more time to have to encrypt everything. But it does provide you a little bit more, what is it called? It hides your final destination and gives you a little more privacy. So why do we still have HTTPS, or why do we have VPN if we have HTTPS, right? So the primary drawbacks to HTTPS is that first of all, it's relying on the browser or the application that has to negotiate that encryption. And it has to, instead of a VPN where it's configured on both your client and your server beforehand, and typically by your IT admin at the in your enterprise, right, who hopefully knows what they're doing. This is every single time it's negotiating between the browser and the server, it has to sit there and figure this out. And if the server doesn't support something or your browser doesn't support something, then it's going to default to a lower level of encryption potentially, or even potentially drop the encryption. So the other thing is that if the browser doesn't enforce what's called HTTPS only mode, or the server does not use what's called HTTP strict transport security to enforce HTTPS, then the initial negotiation between your client, browser, and the server will use unencrypted HTTP to determine if encryption is an option or not. And so that is more vulnerable because now you can redirect, you can do man in the middle to redirect traffic or spoof traffic basically, and you can abuse it more versus the VPN server. If I'm trying to show in the middle here, right? Client going directly to the server, or if you're going through a VPN server or a security service edge as they're called, that also has the added benefit of being able to decrypt your traffic and scan for malware. It can also look for malicious IP addresses maybe and drop your traffic before you hit something malicious. It gives you, using a VPN, you can add additional controls on top of just the encryption. So there's definitely benefits in my mind to why we still need VPN. But again, it depends on your use case and what you're trying to do and what you're trying to protect. On the right-hand side, I tried to go through each of the browser types and show you how you could enable the HTTPS only mode. Obviously, if you're in an organization that takes away the ability to do this, you don't have privileges within your browser, you won't be able to do this. But at least for your home machines, you can set this up yourself. Just know that when you do, that you may have more errors sometimes if the server doesn't support it, and you'll have to remember, oh, I set that setting. If I really want to get there, I might have to change it back for at least for that one time. So hopefully that made sense as to why we still need VPNs, or at least some of the benefits that are there. All right. So let's switch over to network security tools real quick. There's a lot of different tools that we have at our disposal. And I tried to show how they kind of layer here, and we're going to talk about each one of these, right? So starting from the outside in, right, we've got our malicious attacker. It's coming over public internet. One of the first tools we have at our disposal is a web application firewall. A WAF is technically a proxy server, but I split them out because we can actually use them in different ways. So we'll talk about that, what's the differences and how we can utilize them. You can use a proxy server as well in line with the WAF. You then have your traditional firewalls, and there's 4 flavors of those, if you will, and we're going to talk about those. And then you have IDS or IPS systems, and then you have, which may be built into your next-gen firewall, right? Most of them have it. It's a single appliance, right? Usually called a Unified Threat Management Tool, or UTM, but it is its own technology, if you will. And then you also have basically the host-based firewall and or network access control list, depending, especially like in the cloud, you have access control lists versus a more versus a firewall. So it's an object that basically sits on top of your virtual machine. And then traffic coming out of that, traffic exiting from your server going back out to the outside, especially if you want visibility of what it's talking about, right? It'll have to go through not only your network access control list, it has to go through an IDS IPS, has to go through firewall, has to go through potentially a proxy server. We'll talk about that. It will not go through a WAF, right? WAF is one way only. It's not hitting it on the way out, but I just wanted to highlight that it's bidirectional for most of these tools. Any questions here? What I'm planning to do now is go through each one of these and talk about pros and cons, essentially, of each one. All right, so network access control lists and firewalls. There are 4 different types, like I mentioned. So the NACL, or network access control list, is also called a static packet filtering, and that is your most basic firewall, if you will. And all that it does is it can reject traffic based off of allowed or denied IP address plus port combinations. So it's when I say cheaper or expensive on this slide, we're talking about not just money, but also in terms of like CPU cycles and how much overhead there is on the actual hardware. So in other words, you're going to need a beefier firewall with more capabilities, more RAM, etc., to be able to handle things as we move left to right. So the static packet filtering, it works on layer 3 and layer 4 of the OSI model, and it's cheap and it's fast to build rules, but it also has very limited filtering abilities, has no ability to scan or inspect inside the data payload. Next best one, if you will, is the stateful, also known as a dynamic inspection packet firewall. And this is rejecting or allowing, I should say, not just on IP address and port, but it's also on the state of the connection, right? So like, for example, you have a TLS handshake or you have a TCP handshake. It can monitor the state and it's protocol aware. So it knows, hey, it's a TCP handshake looks like this. If I only see half of it, then it's malformed and I'm not going to allow the rest to continue. I'm not going to allow that source to destination traffic to keep flowing until I see that fully resolve. Again, it cannot look inside a payload. It is slightly slower from a rules processing perspective, and it also requires static rules to allow inbound traffic that's unsolicited. So for example, email incoming to an email server, you're going to have to put in static rules to allow that because of the connection states. Next one up is circuit level proxy firewall. This acts on also layer 3, 4, and 5, but it also can do NAT and port translation. And I didn't talk about NATing earlier, but network address translation, but it has that capability. I don't think we need to go into it right now, but just know that it has that ability to do that translation. The benefit is that it's breaking the direct contact between the client and the external server. So it's hiding your internal IPs from the external systems, right? They can see your public IP address. They can't see the internal IP addresses. Also, it's dropping any malformed packets and not forwarding it on. It takes longer. It has to repackage the headers of any traffic coming through. And so it's going to take a minimum of 4 packets per round trip in order to send data in and out. And it also still cannot inspect inside that data payload. The final level, right, is a next-gen firewall, also known as an application level proxy. And so this is looking at layers 3, 4, 5, and now 7, which is where we get the ability to be application aware, and it can see inside and it can strip off encryption, it can re-encrypt, and it can inspect the packets inside from a malicious content perspective. I tried to call out for some of these too where the Center for Information Security, or CIS, some of their rules call out some of these tools. So in this case, 12.9 says that we must ensure that all network traffic to or from internet passes through a authenticated application layer proxy, which is this application level proxy firewall that we're talking about, and make sure that it's configured to filter unauthorized connections. So those are all the different types of firewalls. Most of your home firewalls are going to be the stateful inspection, or really circuit level proxy, because they're doing NATing. So at home, that's what most people will have. If you think about your host-based firewalls, like a Windows firewall, that is really doing just IP address and port. Does it do state? I don't think it even does connection state. So it's really the most basic firewall there. Oops. Okay. So now let's switch and talk about IDS and IPS. So IDS is, I'm going to blank on this. Did I not put it on this page? Ouch. Okay. It is intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention system. I did put it on the page. Good. They are not the same thing. And that is a key point here. They are fundamentally different, even if it's the same vendor, same hardware. The difference in how they work is that an IPS can't handle false positives. They think that they're denial of service. And so because it can't handle that, it fails closed. And so you have to be very careful about what are you putting an IDS an IPS in front of. Because if you put it in front of like a critical website and you turn it on and they get a lot of false positives, you haven't tuned it well, then you're denying your customers from accessing your site, which is not good for business. They're also really bad at preventing data exfiltration because, again, of the number of false positives. There are three different types of IDS and IPS. They mostly signature-based. The newer IDS can do anomaly detection, but essentially the way they work is your most basic is signature matching, which is where we know a known exploit or a known malware. We know what that looks like coming through on the network. And so we build a signature and we say, if it matches this rule, drop it, or at least alert on it, right? And the problem is if you have something new you've never seen, a zero-day quote unquote attack, or you have attacks that slightly change code or change their attack, so they're polymorphic, or there's something custom, again, that you've never seen, then it's not going to be able to match that at all, and it'll let it through. Protocol behavior analysis is a little better. The problem, and that basically works by, and it works for simple or static protocols, and it's looking at how is this protocol working? Does it match known baselines? Part of the problem is simply that there's no standardization really to it, and it's up to the vendor on how they've built it. And a lot of times it's just not well supported. It can break protocols and or can generate a lot of false alerts, which your security folks are going to start ignoring. The best, if you will, quote unquote, is anomaly identification. And this builds out a baseline of what is expected behavior on your network. And then anything that's different from it, it's going to call out. So it can look at things like strings within the data that's being sent, because again, it can unencrypt and view the actual traffic. So it's looking at like names of software. It can look at file paths or directories. It can look at usernames, DNS names, function calls, things like that. The problem with it is that it can take a long time to build up that baseline, or what we call normal. It can also, if you've built in bad into your model, then you may not identify what bad is because it was already built in as normal. And it can take, experienced people to sit there and really dig into what is the model and make sure that you don't have something bad in it. If you want to really have it work well and not have a lot of false positives, then you need to use very small network segments so that a lot of the traffic passing through is relatively the same, right? If you've got 1,000 machines and they're all used for different things and they're all going through this IPS, your normal baseline is going to be so broad that it'll be very hard to catch anything going through. Okay, proxies. So proxies are also in the CIS list, and they're not a tool per se, but you can use them to enforce security controls. So you can use them to, for example, remove or add encryption to network connections that are coming into or leaving your network. You can use them as a choke point, so that way all traffic is forced to go through the proxy and you can inspect it there, you can log it, you can block traffic, you can make a copy and send it off somewhere else. So it's very useful from that perspective. And you can also use it to filter content, right? So a lot of times HR or a security policy may be in place that says we have to drop certain types of traffic, and a proxy can be very useful for doing that. It's a cheap way to do it, if you will. There's two different types. You have reverse proxies and forward proxies, which honestly, I think they're poorly named because I can never remember them, honestly. A reverse proxy is where you have data, something outside the system coming in to your network, and it sits in front of that, and it accepts the connections from outside and delivers it into the server on the inside. Typically, they sit behind a load balancer to control the inbound to the internal servers. If you have a forward proxy, it's the opposite. You have a server that's sending data outwards to an exterior system, and it's using, again, to create that checkpoint and control the outbound network traffic. And the problem with this is that you can bypass the proxy if you know what you're doing, and if you can configure your network settings, you can misconfigure it, or if they are misconfigured, you can change it. And so it's not a perfect solution, but depending on how your host is configured or your server, you can force traffic through it. A WAF, like I said, is a version of a proxy. So it is a reverse proxy. It's again acting at layer 7, and it's application and stateful connection aware. And they can filter requests on a lot of different things. They can filter based on IP, on the HTTP headers or body inspection of the packets. It can filter on URI strings. It can filter on different common attack patterns, which also includes user entity behavior analysis. So it can say, hey, I've seen this IP address, access my server every night at midnight, and now all of a sudden it's trying to get in at noon. That's different. I'm going to at least alert on it. And it can do more sophisticated things than that. They do require very highly skilled resources. I will say that they're probably the top 2 or 3 engineering roles in terms of pay. And you have to not only know how to configure and build rules and feed the WAF and tune it properly, but you also have to understand your applications that are passing through it in order to really, you have to have a good understanding of how like APIs work, how applications build headers and build network packets and send them through in order to really build good policies. So you can either have a block list, you can have an allow list, or more typically a hybrid of both. You use them to, again, detect and defend against volumetric attacks, which is a denial of service, but you can also use it to inspect the data itself to say, hey, is there something that's attacking the application directly, right? So it could be a cross-site forgery, cross-site scripting attack. It could be uploading malicious files. It could be doing a SQL injection attack. And then obviously, if you detect something, you want to drop that traffic and block them. There are multiple ways to deploy them. Most typical is the last one actually in the list, the WAF as a service in the cloud. And that's, you can only unfortunately use it for public-facing applications, but essentially you can use it by pointing your DNS to the WAF, and then anything that's trying to get in to your system has to go through the WAF before it's allowed down to your server. And what you need to do is then on your server or potentially your firewall in front of your server or load balancer, you need to enforce your network access control list, right, to say that that's only allowed to talk to the WAF. So if somebody knows what your IP address is for your public-facing server, they can't just hit it directly and bypass the DNS. You want it to go through the WAF no matter what. So that's how they're typically deployed. But you can deploy it as software on an individual web server, which is simple, but it doesn't scale. Or you can also put it in front of web server farms. So you can use it internally as well. That's the last point down here with the little key, right? You can put it in front of internally facing applications. The reason for doing so in particular is that if they are internal only, right, people don't typically patch them or maintain them nearly as well as something that they know is publicly facing, right? Because they go, oh, I've got a firewall in front of it. Nobody can get to it. I've got too many other things to do. I'm not going to patch it. Well, you can build a rule. If you know there's a vulnerability on an internal system, you can build a rule for any traffic that's trying to exploit that specifically in the WAF a whole lot easier than deploying a patch sometimes. Or it could be that there is no patch available for that particular vulnerability. Maybe it's something relatively new and it takes a vendor, a month or two to deploy a patch. Well, if you can get the information you need, you can build that WAF rule beforehand and protect it without actually patching the endpoint. And you can also use it to detect or try to detect lateral movement within the network itself, which is another reason to deploy it internally. So you can say, hey, have all my critical servers in this network segment, you have to go through WAF, and I'm going to use that as one of the mechanisms to detect for me if somebody's coming in to that network segment. So that was a lot of information again. Take a quick pause. We're almost done. Actually, we are done. Okay. So we went through all the different layers of the network tools that we have available to us and controls. It is complicated. There are lots of controls, and it's very dependent on what you're trying to do. And you need to have clearly defined goals about who's accessing your systems, what systems are they, what types of systems, what types of applications, and really take that into account when you're designing your architecture appropriately. And the cool thing is that network security controls exist at all the layers of the OSI model, which includes layer 8, which is not official, but are people, right, that you need to train them, and you need to train them not only to be careful of what they click on, but also how to configure and build these tools properly. And that is it. Questions?
I think this is a wonderful talk, Yusuf. This is probably the single best under an hour talk on networking I've seen in ever.
Wow.
In fact, you just made me think of a new ideas, and I think I'm going to put up a module in this course that most of these students are in, and say, if you're feeling a little weak in the knees about network security, watch this talk. And if anything comes up that you don't know, at least in passing about, you need to study up on it, because everything you talked about here is fair game in a job interview.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I definitely enjoy putting it together. So,
are you willing to share the deck on this?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. If you'll send me the PowerPoints or a PDF, I'll republish it as a PDF into the course materials.
Okay.
I think a number of students are might be interested in the deck. They'd be better served watching the recorded video, of course, because the explanation counts for a significant value here, I think. But this was a great talk. Are there any questions from any of the students that you might have?
I see one around how common are WAFs.
Okay, go ahead.
They are not, unfortunately, common internally. I think they should be, but they're not really taken advantage in that regard. But they are definitely common outside. There's different types and different flavors. And one thing I didn't really go into, I guess, is bot attacks as much as I thought at the beginning I was going to. So let me spend a little bit of time there. So a bot attack, right, is where your typical user of a site is a human being, right, is interacting typically through a browser and is accessing your site and moving around. Well, when you do that, right, every piece of telemetry of how you're interacting with your browser can be, depending on the site, sent over to the WAF. So, for example, a good example actually is even a mobile device, right? So a mobile device, if you're interacting with a mobile application, if they have a software developer kit that ties to a WAF, for example, it can send how much shaking you're doing of your device, right? Is it laying flat? Is it standing up? Is it, where are you touching on the screen? All sorts of telemetry can be taken from that app and sent. And the reason being is that people, because people are people, can build scripts to emulate human beings. And so they can attack sites. At my company, we run a loyalty program similar to like like Delta Sky Miles, for example, if you're familiar with that, right? Airline miles, we have a similar point system for hotels. It's a big target, unfortunately, for fraud. And so we get lots of attacks where people are trying to pretend to be people, and they will send in, 100,000 requests over the course of like an hour, and it's very hard to tell are they legitimate or not, because they can also use a bot, what do they call the bot army, or basically they'll taken over thousands of devices, and you'll get 1, 2, maybe 3 requests from a single device, and then they'll switch to the next one. So the IP address is constantly changing. You can't build a rule there. You have to build it on based on the user analytics, essentially, or analysis, to say, is this a real person? Is this not? Because you don't want to deny real people, obviously, from getting to your site, but you also don't want a bot that's going to log in and brute force attack or credentials or do a credential stuffing attack with stolen credentials, get access to your people, your customers' information, and then steal it or use it for, against you to get money or whatever. So WAFs are very helpful there from that perspective as well. So in terms of external publicly facing websites or APIs, WAFs are very common. That was a long explanation.
But a good one. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Joseph. We really appreciate it. I think one student wants us to hang around for a few minutes after we shut off the recording.
Sure.
As a personal question. So thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. I appreciate your participation. I look forward to reading, getting some feedback on this from you. So see many of you next week in class on Wednesday. So thank you for your time this evening and have a good night.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the feedback. Thank you.